Hi guys! So today's topic is in honor of Black History Month. It's a video actually that I wanted to make for a very, very long time now. I feel like I say that literally all the time actually. And it's not even like anything stops me. I just get sidetracked with new topics really, really easily. But I'm finally sitting down and devoting an entire video to Addy Walker, the American Girl. Because I think she has both a very fascinating history and an important one. In the context of Black history, of course, but also with dolls in general, and especially American Girl 2 as a brand. I think Addy gives a lot of insight into exactly what goes into crafting these dolls, these girls, these characters. American Girl as a brand is obviously something very closely associated with childhood. And I think due to that, it carries certain implications, certain assumptions that aren't necessarily true, because the average adult isn't really going to take the time to look very deep into the creation of these dolls, and the average child isn't really going to be very privy to that either. And so Addy has been left with a very complicated standing in the American Girl lineup. If I had to describe her reputation, I would describe it as polarizing. But her story is one that I think is really important to talk about, because just speaking in the broader context of dolls in general, Addy holds an extremely influential and prominent role in how Black people, specifically Black girls, have been represented in dolls. Which I'll discuss in more detail, obviously, but I do believe Addy Walker deserves some introduction before we start talking about the more behind-the-scenes stuff. So let's go ahead and get into it. So who is Addy Walker? Who is this doll? Addy was introduced in 1993 as the fifth historical character in the American Girl lineup. And to give some context for those that perhaps aren't aware, American Girl is a doll line that was started in 1986, founded by a schoolteacher named Pleasant Rowland. Now, Rowland's goal was to use dolls as a sort of educational tool, to create characters that gave insight into certain periods of American history. She was very devoted to historical accuracy, and so all the dolls had period-accurate clothing, and each character had a line of storybooks, too, that kind of told their day-to-day life and how they dealt with the major historical events happening in the background. The first three characters were Molly, who represented 1944, World War II times, Kirsten, a Swedish pioneer in 1854, and Samantha, who lived in 1904. Later, they would add Felicity, who represented 1774, the Revolutionary period. So Miss Rowland had a noble goal here, obviously, to show and represent the experiences of young girls in history, who are often a very overlooked demographic. To give the young girls of today, or of the 80s, the chance to connect with figures from the past and to learn about historical facts while doing so. And I want to be clear that this isn't necessarily a criticism, but it is extremely important to point out that every single doll in this original lineup is white. And the perspective that each girl provides is no less important for that fact, but it does mean that a lot of history and a lot of experiences are being left out. According to Miss Rowland, she did actually intend to include a black doll in the original lineup, but opted against it in the end because she didn't believe one would be marketable enough for a newly started company. A 1993 Washington Post article, Wholesome Babes in Toyland by Megan Rosenfeld, quotes Rowland directly on this matter. I felt that the company initially needed to get established financially before we could take the risk that may be inherent in presenting a doll via direct mail into the African American market. Which, by the way, that was how American Girl dolls were sold in the 80s and 90s, through mail catalogs. So Rowland goes on to further elaborate. Because typically, middle-class black consumers do not purchase from direct mail catalogs, which, may or may not be true. The article actually denotes that demographic experts were split on that specific matter, but to make a long story short, American Girl earned millions upon millions of dollars in the early 90s, and so Rowland now felt comfortable enough to introduce a black character into the lineup. There's two articles in particular that I found to be incredible resources while researching this video, and I'm probably going to quote them both a lot because they provide a lot of personal commentary on the matter too. They are the Slate article, The Making of an American Girl by Aisha Harris, and the Paris Review article, Addy Walker, American Girl by Britt Bennett. So to talk about just who Addy is as a character for a few minutes, because I think that's extremely important context in understanding why she's such a polarizing figure. Addy's time period is set in 1864 during the Civil War, and Addy herself starts her story as an enslaved person on a North Carolina plantation. The first book details her and her mother's escape to freedom, and all the books afterwards are about Addy adjusting to her new life. But it also devotes a lot of time really showcasing the absolutely horrific, inhumane, and frankly traumatizing conditions that Addy and her family were subjected to. And the decision to craft this sort of backstory for American Girl's first black character was absolutely not without criticism. To quote Britt Bennett, "For 17 years, Addy was the only black historical doll. She was the only non-white doll until 1998. If you were a white girl who wanted a historical doll who looked like you could imagine yourself in Samantha's Victorian home, or with Kirsten, weathering life on the prairie. If you were a black girl, you could only picture yourself as a runaway slave." And Aisha Harris said something pretty similar too. "I've had my own difficulties wrestling with how Addy made me feel as a child. A lot of these feelings are rooted not in disdain for Addy herself, but for the clear-cut lack of choice. While my white peers could pick from any number of varied characters in their likeness, I could not." There were also concerns that Addy was perhaps not really meant for a black audience, rather that she was for a white audience, and that the pain and trauma she experiences isn't so much educational as it is gratuitous. Because when you factor in, like, a play factor, it gets almost uncomfortable to imagine, right? Felicity rides like the wind on her cool horse. Samantha, you can have a tea party with her. Addy, she's forced to eat worms and has to leave her baby sister behind on her escape to freedom. So it is kind of easy to see how people were coming to that conclusion. But there's two really important pieces of context here. One is, of course, that Addy does not stay an enslaved person for her story. The vast majority of the time spent with Addy is her experiencing freedom and a brand new life. She has celebrations and parties and pretty dresses, and I'm pretty sure there was no accessory or outfit or playset sold that alluded to her time as an enslaved person. Another important fact is that the decision to set Addy's story during times of slavery did not come from Pleasant Rowland. When Addy Walker was being conceived, Rowland had enough foresight to realize that she and her company, which was primarily made up of white people, did not necessarily have the credentials to put together this character on their own. So Addy was the first doll to be created with the help of a formal advisory board, which included a lot of prominent black scholars, historians, and intellectual figures. Lonnie Bunch and Spencer Crew, who were curators at the Smithsonian, Cheryl Chisholm, a film producer, Violet Harris, an expert on black children's literature, Wilma King, a historian and expert on American slavery, June Powell of the National Afro-American Museum and Cultural Center, and Janet Sims Wood, a librarian and scholar that specialized in stories of black women. And according to the article from Harris, this advisory board did brainstorm a few different time periods to set this new character in, including the Harlem Renaissance. But the board eventually came to the consensus that in order for children to understand other periods of black American history, they needed to first understand the foundation of slavery and how it affected black Americans moving forward in time. And Cheryl in particular noted that We, the board members, were all very concerned that the experience of slavery not be whitewashed. The advisory board, working with Rowland and the in-house researchers that worked for Pleasant Company, spent about a year developing Addy and her story, because they wanted her story to be accurate, to be reflective of real history, but they did have to stay conscious of how young the target audience was. So I don't imagine that was a very easy balance to strike. It was also very, very important to this advisory board that the author of Addy's storybooks be a Black American. The company eventually settled on Connie Porter, whose novel Albright Court had recently found pretty strong critical acclaim. And although Porter wasn't too familiar with the American Girl brand at the time and actually wasn't too strong on children's literature, she actually seemed pretty excited for the opportunity and devoted herself to ensuring she got everything right. The advisory board also came in clutch here. Harris's article also points out how they worked with Porter to pinpoint a specific week in 1864 that had a full moon, so that little detail in Addy's escape scene would be entirely accurate. But not everyone who worked on Addy would remember it as such a positive experience. In particular, the original illustrator of Addy's books, Melody Rosales. Rosales joined the project pretty late into its development, but was removed in 1993, the same year that Addy debuted, and she was only able to illustrate 3 books in total. According to Rosales, her experience was pretty negative right from the beginning. She experienced microaggressions from the mostly white employees at Pleasant Company, detailing one employee who expressed shock over her appearance and said they expected her to be darker. Rosales also said that her and Rowland were constantly at odds regarding her illustrations. One disagreement in particular stemmed from how Rosales intentionally illustrated some characters in Addy's life to have a lighter skin tone, most notably Addy's wealthy bully, Harriet, in order to acknowledge themes of colorism. And according to Rosales, Rowland was against this and said that the issue of colorism was too complex for a children's book. Eventually, the disagreements came to a head and Rowland terminated Rosales' employment. There's a Chicago Tribune article from 1993 that actually does go into this dispute a little more. "This is a money venture," Rosales said. "This has nothing to do with being sensitive to the community." Rowland dismisses Rosales as a disgruntled employee angry over being fired. "It is a labor issue that cannot be discussed," she said. To attribute racism to a company that has worked hard and spent a great deal of money to bring a historical Black character to life, she said, is patently ridiculous. So, speaking of 1993, Addy is released, and her reception is, for the most part, pretty positive, especially among children. A lot of the articles about Addy reference the famous 1947 doll test, which was a study on the psychological effects of segregation on Black children. Children were asked to choose between 4 dolls that were all identical aside from their color, to choose which one they preferred. And overwhelmingly, it was found that these children preferred the white dolls and attached more positive attributes to them. The conclusion being that segregation, prejudice, racism had an extremely negative impact on the self-esteem and self-image of young Black children. And this experiment would also be referenced in testimony during Brown versus the Board of Education. And obviously, there's a lot of time between 1947 and 1993. 46 years to be exact. But the effects of segregation, of institutional racism, doesn't just vanish over the course of 1 or 2 generations. The doll industry had made incredible strides in the representation of Black characters over the years, but it wasn't a perfect world. And so Addy had a lot of pressure and a lot of expectations behind her, because it kind of harkens back to what Bennett and Harris said earlier. White children had options, but Addy had the responsibility of representing and reflecting every single Black consumer, which just unfortunately is an entirely impossible thing to do. But Addy did make a difference where it counted, I think. There's another article I found that goes over Addy's release and the public perception of her. "I've had other African American dolls, but I didn't know anything about them," said Mercedes, a Fort Worth resident who is African American. Addy is courageous. She is nice and she is smart. It's not just the outside, the inside counts too. Yet there is concern and disagreement. Cheryl Hudson, co-owner of an independent African-American publishing company, Just Us Books in East Orange, NJ, says she has found the Addy doll and books objectionable, particularly the doll. It's crass merchandising of slavery. It trivializes slavery. That is a revolution and a renaissance, W. Marvin Delaney said. This doll is right on time. We now know that even though we were slaves, we don't have to be ashamed. I don't think the controversy about this will ever cease, because we have not come to grips with this chapter of American history and what it means, Harris said. We will always want to distance ourselves from it, but this is something that needs to be brought out. So you can definitely see the two sides. On the one hand, Pleasant Company is a business owned by a white woman, primarily staffed with white people. And although the company has an interest in education, they are still a business. They're motivated by money and profit and consumability. The Harris article even includes a tidbit about how Pleasant Rowland was originally against the idea of the Addy doll having textured hair, because she thought it would impede on the hairplay aspect of American Girl dolls and affect her marketability. And with Addy, this is now a company that is actively profiting off a story about slavery and turning that story into a pretty expensive purchasable object, a doll. On the other hand, this is a toy that was carefully curated by a team of prominent black scholars and historians who very obviously had nothing but good intentions and wanted to tell a story that very much needed to be told. Yes, slavery is uncomfortable, it's unpleasant, but it's a part of American history, and it's a reality that girls like Addy faced. And, to be honest, speaking as someone who grew up first in the Arkansas school system and then the Texas school system, American education can be incredibly inadequate when it comes to teaching about the realities of slavery and the Civil War. For a lot of children, Addy was their first exposure to this kind of history, because American Girl respected its audience enough to know that it didn't need to be sanitized in order to be a hopeful, happy story in the end. And I'm not here to say that one mindset is more correct than the other, because literally, who am I to tell anyone how to feel about this, right? Or what experience they should have with a doll like Addy. But this is a quote from Britt Bennett in her article that has stuck with me for a very long time. This is the particular joy of an American Girl doll. She's a doll your age who will rise with her story told. She allows you to leap into history and imagine yourself alongside her. Addy humanizes slavery for children, which is crucial since slavery, by definition, strips humanity away. It would be almost another 20 years before American Girl would add another black character to its historical lineup, and that's after the Pleasant Company was sold to Mattel. In 2011, they introduced Cecile Ray, who came as a duo with another character, Marie Grace Gardner. Both characters represented New Orleans in 1853, with Cecile providing insight into communities of free black families in the South. When Cecile came out, it was actually seen as a pretty big deal, at least as far as the news and such were concerned, that she wasn't an enslaved person, which, although she did come many, many years after the fact, was a pretty welcome way to address the criticisms that were still being levied towards Addy. Unfortunately, Cecile was fully discontinued only 3 years later, in 2014, so not really much of a band-aid, right? 2016 would debut Melody Ellison, who lived during the civil rights movement of the 1960s, and most recently we got Claudie Wells in 2022, who represents the period of the Harlem Renaissance. Hi guys, quick editing note here. So, something I forgot to mention, and something I didn't even put together until I started researching for this video, is that the current author of the Claudie Wells books is Britt Bennett, the author of the Paris Review article. So that's just a really cool full circle moment there. And I don't want this to come off like I'm praising American Girl for fixing things. There is still very big problems with diversity in its historical line. There's still no Asian character in the lineup at all. The only one we ever got was an auxiliary character to another white character, and she had an extremely short run with very few pieces in her collection. Now, it's more to point out that hopefully with more choice, Addy's story doesn't have to be subjected to the kind of pressure and scrutiny that other characters don't necessarily have. And while any amount of criticism is welcome and necessary, really, especially if it pertains to someone's personal experience, there's also more opportunity to appreciate Addy for what she is, what she was able to accomplish, and where she stands in doll history. In history in general, really. So something I really wanted to be able to do was to provide insight from Black collectors who had experience with Addy in order to give that perspective in this video, because this is obviously something I am personally unable to give. So I did put out a little call on my Twitter for anyone who wouldn't mind being quoted in this video, and I'm going to read some of the responses I got. Under the tree, I got 2 dolls. I was so happy, like, OMG, I got my own doll. And I unwrapped Cecile and Addy and was completely perplexed. But seeing that they looked like me was enough. I loved them both and played with them and created stories for them like they were any other doll. I do regret uncurling Cecile's hair. Oops. But my mother was very surprised that these were the only historical AG Black dolls. She had grew up seeing a bunch of white AG dolls that her friends owned. She never looked down on my grandmother for gifting me a slave doll since, well, there were only like 2 options. Doll diversity was very important to my family because there wasn't a lot of Black dolls on shelves, so I never hated my Addy doll, but reading up on her history and how controversial her release was very shocking to learn about. Addy's books helped me understand what my ancestors went through. My 3rd great-grandmother, Johanna, was only 2 years older than Addy when slavery ended in Alabama, so it was like seeing the world through her eyes. I couldn't afford the dolls growing up, but I love the books. I collect them now, and Addy was my first. When I first unboxed her, I hugged the doll, and it felt like hugging family. She even looked like my Aunt Stacy. Addy's books moved me, especially Changes for Addy. Changes for Addy came out right when I lost 3 of my eldest relatives back to back. It felt like Addy was grieving with me, and it was chicken soup for the soul, if you will. Of course, I love Addy's story and the representation I did have, even though minimum. I couldn't relate to McKenna because I grew up in a poor middle-class family. Looking back, me only having white dolls to choose from concerning AG was very problematic. I didn't really realize until I hit my current age of 22 that, damn, there hasn't been a lot of Black representation, and what we did get dealt with slavery. While I wish she wasn't alone for so many years, I agree with the reasoning behind Addy being created as the first Black doll. And frankly, she should have been in the very first original lineup. Addy as a character is just a sweet, cute little girl, and I think that's what makes her such a nice character. Her stories are extremely important and educational. She's gone through a lot, and her first book especially is downright horrifying, but she's still just a cute little girl who wants to wear pretty dresses and have picnics and play with her friends and family and make puppets and all that stuff. She's not just the tragic slave doll in the collection. And I'll close the video with one more quote. The closing lines of Aisha Harris's article in which she quotes Connie Porter. She is a voice, she is a face, an embodiment of the lives of our African American ancestors. She takes readers past whatever negative connotations they may put on the word slave. They see Addy being what that world didn't want people to see. A child, a human being with hopes and dreams, family, history, and the potential to live a full and abundant life, if given the chance. So big thank you to everyone who took the time to talk to me, and as always, thank you so much for watching this video. I'm very happy I finally got to work on it, and it was a very insightful, very interesting research process. I definitely came out of it with a new appreciation for Addy, and I hope the same for you as well. But of course, here's your opportunity to tell me if you've ever grown up with American Girl, with Addy, and what your experience was like with her. I'm extremely interested in anything and everything you want to tell me, because, you know, this is clearly a very nuanced, very complex topic. I hope I did it justice. I hope I did Addy justice. But when you're done with all that, just be sure to like and subscribe for any future fashion doll content. Thank you.